Start recording.
I stay to the belts.
Oh.
Nice to meet you. Lovely.
I think now on the campuses,
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure there'll be a few more people who will join us. Please keep yourselves on mute unless you are me or Lord Glasman. Rabbi Fromson, could I ask you to highlight Maurice and me so that people can see the two of us next to each other, please? That's great. Thank you very much. Good evening and a warm welcome to my third and final guest in our Meet the Lords series. My guest for this evening is Lord Maurice Glasman, Labour peer, eminent political theorist, social commentator, and defender of the working classes. Now, Maurice, I've invited you here this evening because you're in the House of Lords, the members of which are usually selected for their ability to make a particular contribution to the national narrative, to the country in some existential and broader way. Could you tell us about your journey into the Lords and why you think you were appointed?
Oh, I think it was
just a light starting point.
Yeah, I think it was a massive mistake, and I think everybody.
You could speak up just a little, Maurice.
Yeah, massive mistake, I think, and I think that everybody who contributed to that decision has lived to regret it. Essentially, I wasn't involved with Labour at all. I was sort of an academic, and I was involved in something called community organising, which involved working essentially with different faith communities. The big thing we did was living wage, you know, the dignity of labour or the dignity of work was shared between all different kinds of faith communities. I got really discovered, I really enjoyed that. We also had a sort of anti-usury campaign after the crash, you know, trying to have a limit on interest rates. And then around 2008, there was the financial crash. And my mum was very ill. She had a terrible disease called supranuclear palsy. Doesn't get worse than that. Progressive supranuclear palsy. So that cured me of being a progressive because I realized that things could get worse. And my mum was, you know, from a dead tribe. She was very from, so not very from, but from enough for the so roughly. We didn't touch money or watch telly on Shabbos. That was where we were. But I guess occasionally lights were turned on. I don't know how. That sort of thing. So she was very conservative, but very Labour, very committed to Labour. And when she died, I kind of just sort of wrote a love letter to her, which was called Blue Labour, which was a sort of Owl of Nineveh operation. What Labour had lost, its relationship with the working class, its patriotism. She was very patriotic. And to my astonishment, 9 months later, there I was in the House of Lords. There you go. So
I suspect they were being somewhat modest about the kind of range of achievements and contributions that you made to get there, but I will probe you a bit further about as we go along. Now, when you entered the Lords, Maurice, you chose the title Baron Glasman of Stoke, Newington and Stamford Hill, and you live in the area.
Yeah.
This speaks very much to your origins and strong identification with the world of your background. Please tell us about your early life and loves. You've spoken a little bit about your late mother already, but fill us in with some more background details and influences.
Yeah, so, Ernest Bevin, he said that he was brought up in the bowels of the Labour movement. I think you could say that I was brought up in the bowels of the Jewish community, certainly. So so my mum's family were all from Stamford Hill. So my bubba and my mum was one of 5 sisters. They all lived in Stamford Hill, but we went up in the world and we moved to Palmer's Green. So it's kind of bussed back to Stamford Hill every day. I went to a school called Clapton Jewish Day School, which was run by, that's where I got my understanding of Stalinism, from Rose Stiftel Lippmann, who was the headmistress, who was also the leader of the Labour Council. Number of councillors, 65, number of Labour councillors, 65. It was that sort of operation. And so went back to school there. So I had this very strong link to Stamford Hill. And what were my loves? I would say that the 3, my family, but the 3 big institutions that everybody seemed to support were, everybody that we knew was a member of the United Synagogue. Everybody. My mum was very suspicious of, let us say, reform. That was beyond the bounds. Everybody supported Spurs. That was another one. So you had, and everybody that we grew up with at that time was affectionate, let's say, to Labour. Those were the 3. So Harvey, thank God for the United Synagogue, is all I can say, really, given the state of the other 2 institutions. Grew up in a house, played lots of music, jazz. My dad played the electric guitar. My brother was very talented at playing the piano. I played the trumpet. But we went to, when I think back on it, we went to Jewish Cub Scouts. We had a Jewish big band, entirely made up of sort of Jewish dads who were musicians. We played the Basie book, Duke Ellington, that sort of thing. So I didn't really come across, I don't think, anybody who wasn't Jewish as a kind of social equal until I went to university. It was extraordinary to look back on. And I would say, family, my mum really liked David Ben-Gurion, that I remember, and was quite keen on Yitzhak Rabin. We had his photo up in the kitchen. So I'll give you some sense of the orientation of where we were. And I was sent to Lubavitch camp. I've got the Lubavitch experience as well.
Right, and how was that for you?
Well, I'm still assimilating the experience. I'm still processing it, as they say, in therapeutic terms.
Now, I'm going to move forward a little bit before winding back. You've been a university professor in Italy,
Yeah.
a jazz musician,
Mhm.
and you've been honoured by the Pope for your contribution to contemporary Catholic theology.
Mhm.
These are extraordinarily eclectic achievements. Perhaps you could speak a little to each of them and explain how a nice Jewish boy from East London got involved in these things. Most people I came across haven't done any of these.
Okay, so the Labour love story goes quite a long way back. That it was a sort of family inheritance, as I've tried to explain. But I knew that something was wrong. Something was wrong with Labour anyway. So I went to university. I went to Cambridge. I did history. Then I played music for a while. Then I did a master's in political philosophy up at York, and then I got this scholarship to Italy to go and do my PhD in Italy. So I had that Italian experience. And what I discovered out there in Italy, which I had no idea existed, so I was looking for a way that you could uphold, let's say, the dignity of Labour without having a centralized state, without having an authoritarian state. I couldn't stand. Obviously, it's easy to hate the Soviet Union, which I do, but I wasn't very keen on Fabianism either. But how could you develop a democratic politics that didn't end up with excluding working people, that gave them some status, some dignity, some notion of a home in the world? And I couldn't get anywhere with it. And then I was doing my PhD on all this stuff when the Soviet Union collapsed. So, that was a moment. And I was quite a strong supporter in my youth of the Solidarity movement in Poland, a combination, democracy, trade unions, that sort of thing. And then I saw that completely smashed by, globalization, you might say. But I discovered there in Italy this Catholic social thought. And Catholic social thought gave me something that I couldn't find in Jewish social thought, which was obviously my starting point, which is the critique of capitalism, the idea that human beings and nature are not commodities, and that through association, people together, I mean, it's very deep in our practice. You talk about East London, in the East End,
Just a slight technical problem here. I think you might be on mute. That's it. Are you back?
I'm now back. I'm
back with us, Maurice.
There were 6,000 Jewish mutual organizations, Arbeiter Ring, workers' circles paying for funerals, welfare organizations, insurance organizations. I was very interested in that. But Catholic social thought was very interesting to me because it had a conception of democracy and of workers without being a centralized state, and it built on faith. So it gave a very important part. So that led to a lot of Blue Labour stuff is based on that. Yeah. So I was invited to the Vatican. Yeah. I was invited to give a talk. It was a Friday afternoon in the Vatican, and Pope Francis had just got the job. So that was an experience. So it was like the new boss was in town. You could tell he was the boss because he was dressed all in white. Everybody else was in various different colours. And they invited me over to give this talk. It was a very strange experience, Rabbi.
That's right. Now, that's really fascinating, but in a completely different area of your clearly eclectic and quite broad range of interests, you also been a jazz musician. And in fact, the piece of music we will hear at the end of the evening is actually a Gershwin piece played by Maurice. So Maurice, tell us a little bit about your interest and experiences as a jazz musician.
Well, as I say, my dad played the electric guitar. My uncle Lawrence was a really proper jazz drummer. He was married to my auntie Marion. I mean, he made an album with Chet Baker the album's called Chet Baker in Milan, around about 59. So I was brought up with swing music.
And clearly an interest in Italy.
Yeah. There's also the Italian connection. Yeah.
Collection, yeah.
Yeah. With with and the idea of improvised swing was always really captivating to me. So I played the trumpet. I can't say I was really great at it, but I love to play and to improvise. And at that time, there was none of this stuff with cultural appropriation and things. I mean, within our circle of people, African American music was considered like Jewish music. You know, Stan Getz and all these people. So I was brought up with jazz, and I love to play it.
Okay, now you touched briefly on perhaps what you're most well known for in the public narrative, which is Blue Labour.
Yeah.
You started by mentioning Blue Labour as a love story, a love letter,
yeah.
a love letter to your late mother. But it's more than that. It's a fairly serious political ideology, a way of thinking, which has had a great influence on contemporary political narrative. And I also happen to think probably his time has not yet fully come. We had a really fascinating chat last week about the current state of the Labour Party, its contemporary travails, and some of which I think will be of interest to our audience. So could you take it away? I think maybe people would like first to hear what the primary kind of driving ideas of Blue Labour are for those who aren't familiar, and then perhaps talk a little bit about how they play to aligned with or maybe misaligned with the current Labour Party.
Yeah, I think the best way to understand it for us is it's quite close to the Toam Derech Eretz movement established by Samson Raphael Hirsch in Frankfurt. So it's got a very strong idea of the Labour tradition, which was always upheld liberty. Freedom of religion was very important. It brought together different communities. At that time, we tend to forget that Catholic and Protestant were really hostile in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in Liverpool, Manchester, as well as in London. So the Labour tradition of liberty of association is extremely important. So in many ways, it's trying to retrieve a home in the world for people, and to remember that Labour was an enormous blessing. Our country, the working class were faithful to it in the 20s and the 30s. Our country didn't go communist and it didn't go fascist. I've got a very strong commitment to Labour as a civilizing force. But the key thing was a covenantal relationship with the working class. That was the key thing. And then through that, of the working class to Parliament and to the civic institutions. And what I've seen over my lifetime is a continuing estrangement from the working class as the Labour Party becomes more middle class, more progressive, more abstract, more liberal. You know, so it's I've been eyewitness to a tragedy, really, which is this estrangement. And it's, you know, the key to the fact, if you look at the original forms of the Labour movement, there were three fundamental things. The first was Labour as an interest, the idea of the dignity of the worker. So very briefly, and I'm sorry to talk like this, but it's 8:30, so I can use this language. So forgive me, everybody, if it sounds technical, but under capitalism, the pressure is for human beings and for nature to be turned into commodities. That's the fundamental process of capitalism. So it always requires some political resistance to that, to preserve the integrity of nature and of human community. But what we've been living through for the last 30 to 40 years is really what I would call globalization, and all this stuff is an explosion of this commodification. So historically, the Labour movement was very pro-worker. It was very keen on community and stable, settled community, and it saw a bigger role for the state in the economy. And that's exactly where we are now. Now, the present era is defined precisely by that. The state has a bigger role. Look at furlough, look at the vaccine, loads of money going into industrial strategy. Suddenly, the working class are much more important than people thought. And the places that they live, look at Hartlepool, are much more important than people think. But unbelievably, the Labour movement can't move into that space. And it's the Conservative government that has seized the political time. So so what I'm saying is about Labour is not just they don't know what to do, but they don't know where they are. They're deeply estranged from their own tradition.
And how might the objectives of Blue Labour, as you see its way of thinking, may reconnect Labour with its lost Kahilla, as you described it to me last week?
Yeah, it's like a, you know, it's like a liberal shawl Labour in a kind of United Synagogue Kahilla. That's how I view it. You know, it can't really relate to the Church of England's got the same problem. I mean, the Labour movement, there was a big Jewish contribution, but it was fundamentally Christian. You know, it was Catholic, it was nonconformist with a bit of a high church Anglican blessing. Their language was about brotherhood. Fellowship is life used to be the thing that was on every Labour Party membership form. You know, it emerged from faith, but it's completely estranged. So I see the role of Blue Labour as to restate the tradition, the integrity of the tradition, its relevance to the present moment. You know, it's a strangely popular movement. I can't quite fathom it, but it grows in its way. But it's very difficult because there's such an aggressive, liberal, progressive, secular dominion at the moment that when people talk about family and they talk about love, they talk about attachment, they talk about belonging, the domination of just this idea of justice and rights without looking at democracy and community means that it's very difficult for Labour to rebuild its relationships.
Okay.
It's up to you, Rabbi.
We might come back to it. Let's do a little. Let's steer in a slightly different direction, because I also think, and thinking ahead to a few minutes' time, that there will be quite a lot of questions, and I suspect there'll be an opportunity to elaborate on some of these ideas in response to questions. We're not yet at the question point, but if you do have questions that are accumulating, please post them in the chat, and then I can sift them and pass them on to Maurice. Now, over the past year or so, we've become very friendly, and we try to meet weekly, and it's a bit of a highlight of the week, actually, our chats about all kinds of things. But we first met via our mutual and very much lamented friend, Rabbi Pinter, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha, from Stamford, who died of COVID in the first phase around Pesach time last year, who was a truly outstanding, some might say the only notable leader in the religious community in N16. I know that Avrami was very important to you. Could you tell us a little bit about him, for those who didn't know him, and your friendship with him, and why it was so important to you?
Oh, well, there's a family story in relation to Rabbi Pinter, which is I'd like to share, I guess, is that so my dad's family were, no disrespect, Rabbi, they were Federation. They were in the Federation.
You may not know this, but until I came to the Golders Green, I was a rabbi the first part of my career in the Federation. So we'll live.
I've always wanted to keep it from you, but I felt that I couldn't do that anymore.
It's fine. I've kept from you the fact that for 5 years I was the rabbi of the Federation Shul.
Okay, well, I'm glad you've come.
I think I may have kept it from my congregants as well.
That takes courage, what you've just done. So I just want to acknowledge your courage in coming out. And
so it's over to you to share something personal now then.
Yeah, and my mum's family were Adas. They were kind of in the Adas. Rabbi Schonfeld, Diane Grunfeld, these were huge figures from my childhood. My glasses, which haven't got on, but my glasses are definitely Yeka glasses. They're a daily tribute to how the Yeka leadership looked when I was young. I thought it was magnificent, and I tried.
This is Stamford Hill, circa 1975.
Well, so yes, circa probably 1968, if we want to be
right.
technical.
Okay, very good. Right.
But my grandfather, my mum's dad, he was he was a presser. Let's just say that his Hebrew wasn't that good. Let's just say that he didn't find it. He wasn't a Yeka, and he was a bit uncomfortable in the Adas. So he used to go and daven at Rabbi Pinter's dad, Shmelka Pinter's shul on Heathland Road.
I knew Vicky and I knew Reb Shmelka Pinter. We spent a wonderful Purim with him actually when we were engaged a long time ago in the late 80s.
Yeah, so he was a very, very big figure in Stamford Hill, and very sadly, my grandfather died when he was very young. My mum was already married, but her remaining 4 sisters were on Bethune Road, which is the road just along from Heathland Road, and my Zyda died, and they didn't know what to do, so they went and they knocked on Shmelka Pinter's door. I think it might have been 1 in the morning or 12 at night, and bless him, he not only came to the house, but he stayed with the body all night, and he buried my Zyda in Edmonton. And for that reason, there was always a very strong family connection that he honoured my grandfather. He was a very poor man and not, let's just say, not a scholar for sure. And he really honoured him. And so Rabbi Pinter and I got to know each other, and then that really intensified over the years. When I got the peerage, I said, you know, I'm a bit uncomfortable taking the Stamford Hill job. You know, really and truly, you should have it. And he said, no, very generously. He said, I know, he said, but it's okay. So he gave me the hechsher to have the Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill billing. And I learned a huge amount from him. I mean, he was really a very different kind of interfaith. I went with him to the local mosques. They used to stand when he walked in. And he did work at Homerton Hospital on stuff like autopsy, kosher food, halal food. Very good relationship with the local black church. He was an extraordinary figure. And within the Hasidic community, I think because of his dad and because of the sort of lineal connection with the Baal Shem Tov, he had good relationships with all the different groups. So I just used to love to hang out with him and listen to how he negotiated all these different relationships. And he was Labour. He was very blue Labour, deep dark blue Labour.
He was a Labour councillor for many years, wasn't he?
He was the only Labour politician who beat Tony Blair in an election. They both went for the same council seat, and Rabbi Pinter won. So he used to always remind Tony Blair of that, I beat you. I mean, it's unbelievable to think that Tony Blair opened Yesterday Hotel. Rabbi Pinter set up this a Haredi girls' school in Stamford Hill. So he was extraordinary, and I miss him terribly, really terribly.
Now, kind of following on from that, we've been working on a long-term project together over the last year, which is still ongoing and in many ways intensifying. And it's around how to understand covenantal ideas, which you've touched on as one of the core tenets of the original Labour Party, how to understand covenantal ideas as the basis for an alternative, perhaps slightly more progressive way of organising society and the economy. Could you explain briefly how this works? I know that might take a lifetime, but could you give us some insight into the audience insight about how you see these ideas that we've been speaking about really pretty much every week now for an extended period?
Yeah, so maybe that's a good way of understanding Blue Labour a bit better, is that we live in a covenantal country. So the first thing about covenant is that it's intergenerational. It binds through the generations. So we've got a monarchy, we've got a parliament, there's the common law. These are intergenerational things, covenantal things that we can understand that way. Obviously, our faith is a covenantal faith in a fundamental way that binds through the different generations. But increasingly, the economy was contractual. So this, I thought, and I still think, leads to the polarization, is that rich get richer and the poor get poorer and the social ties fray. And then certainly with the beginning of lockdown, I began to think about that much more. I mean, for me, Brexit was a form of covenantal redemption, you know, that there was a foreign system that wished to undermine, but we had this thing, the ancient constitution, the balance of interests rather than the separation of powers. But I saw it as a moment of renewal, certainly. And then with lockdown, I began to think about debt and how, and obviously within the our covenantal tradition, there's fantastic work on the Jubilee is one thing, and the Shemitah year, and the release of debt, and the way that the covenant bound the different interests. So it wasn't just intergenerational, but the different tribes were bound together. So there was local autonomy, which I think is extremely important. And then there's the treatment, the covenantal treatment of the worker, you know, the dignity of the worker, the fact that they debts have to be relieved every 7 years. And I began to think that with the end of lockdown, with the massive accumulation of debt in business, then maybe we should conceptualize this as a covenantal moment. Where, and the other thing with the covenant is the environmental matter, that the land is a partner. It's an active partner, and obviously within the original system, the land was left fallow once every 7 years. But this idea of not treating nature as a commodity, of having some notion that it has an integrity in itself. So in terms of community, in terms of the environment, in terms of debt, in terms of the dignity of labor, the more I explored the covenant, the richer it got. And Harvey, I really appreciate the work that we do together on that. I think I agree with you. I think it's amazing.
It's certainly one of the probably most stimulating hours of my week, our chat, although tomorrow I expect you're going to want to use half of it to talk about how this went.
Okay. It's okay. We can
okay, it is something which I'm enjoying enormously, and I suspect those who have joined Zoom and have heard some of my recent sermons will notice that some of these ideas about covenantal partnerships and about some of these similar ideas have kind of begun to creep in more than they did before we started talking. So if anyone doesn't like it, you can blame Lord Glasman for that. Now, I perhaps touched on this already, but I'm going to ask, sorry, Maurice, we're about to say something.
I take responsibility.
Yeah, thank you. That's good of you. Who would you name? You've touched on quite a number of important figures, but who would you name as the most influential figure in your development?
Well, you know, I've mentioned, well, there was my mum and my dad. I'm delighted that my Auntie Marion is on the call, and I would like to honour her. Hi, Auntie Marion, lovely to see you. I mean, I would say that Samson Raphael Hirsch, if you want to talk intellectually, that was very important in the self-organisation of community. Torah Dorech Eretz is an extremely important part of my thinking. There's a thinker called Karl Polanyi, who I think is great, who wrote a book called The Great Transformation. Many, I mean, in terms of my life, in terms of living figures, I went to JFS and I was in a lot of trouble, and there was a history teacher there, Josephine Wagerman, and she kind of pointed the finger at me, and that's how I got into Cambridge, just because she said you could do it. I was pretty skeptical, and so was everybody else. I've been blessed. There's been many people who've shown me love and support in my life. So, but I would say, yeah, and Rabbi Pinter was a very important figure in that.
Thank you. Now, a couple of questions have already appeared in the chat, but before I go to them and encourage other audience questions, perhaps you could, just to end this part of the evening, share a memorable moment from your very varied and distinguished career thus far.
Well, I think I'll go back. The one that really sticks in my mind is that talk I gave at the Vatican, because I didn't quite go into the details, but it was an Erev Shabbos. It was a Friday afternoon. If you know anything about Italy, people hate to be, they like to go away for the weekend. And I gave this talk, and when I finished the talk, there was this very tense atmosphere, and nobody really knew where the Pope was at. And this guy, an American cardinal, said, "Well, there's a word for what you're saying, Lord Professor, whoever you are, Glasman." It was pretty hostile. He said, "It's called communism." He said, he said, "You're trying to interfere in the prices, you're trying to interfere in business." And then I kind of Italian cardinal then said, no, I think, he was quite Jewish. He said, no, I think this is a very faithful expression of the teaching. And I'm standing there on the stage. It was quite tense, really. And then another Spanish guy said, no, I don't like what you're saying. And then another guy said, I do like what you're saying. And the Pope was silent. And then he stood up and he turned around to the American and he said, in Italian, but thank God I understand, so I translate. He said, what's your idea? He said that you sack the parents, but you buy the children pencils at school. Is that your idea? And then he came up onto the stage and he gave me a medal and he said to this whole formal group, he said, well, this is not the first time we've taken leadership from a Jew. So I thought that was one of the more outstanding moments.
Very good. That's with that kind of wry and very entertaining vignette. I'm going to move to some of the questions, if I may. From Lewis, one to start with from Lewis. And of course, you'll answer this on your own way if you wish. What are your views on accusations of anti-Semitism in the Red Labour Party, whose benches on which you sit and represent in the House of Lords? You are on mute, Maurice, for some reason. Are you able to unmute yourself? We have a technical problem. Rabbi Fromson, are you able to unmute Maurice?
Let me just, who am I trying to unmute?
Maurice.
Oh, he's just, how did that happen? Right.
There we go.
There we
Maurice,
go.
sorry, apologies. Sorry.
That was
I have some thoughts, if you feel it's appropriate, about accusations of anti-Semitism recently in the Labour Party, if you want to comment on that.
It's just to say it's very real. It's something that's existed for a very long time. Anybody who's been to university over the last 40 years will come across it. So there's, it has to be understood in that way. So there's a great hostility. Israel is seen as look, we're living through it right now at this moment with what's going on in Jerusalem, that Israel's a sort of colonial thing and it's oppressive and it's racist and all those things. They've existed for a very long time. And then there's a very strange part, and it's always existed in the left, that essentially views capitalism as a Jewish conspiracy, the Rothschilds and all of this. So there's it's not the dominant view at all. There's huge parts of the Labour movement that are very hostile to that anti-Semitism, but it's part of the world. It's not just on the left, obviously, but it's migrated there too. So it's a permanent part of the life.
Okay, I'm going to go to from Lord Wasserman. Maurice, Gordon is you may know this, so we interviewed Gordon as my guest last week. Do you see a role for the cooperative movement in your ideal blue Labour future? This is a question from Gordon. Do you see a role for the cooperative movement in your ideal blue Labour future? I think you might actually need to explain the terms, certainly to me, because I don't think I understand the question. And he's on mute again. Okay.
I'm off.
You're ice mute. He's ice mute.
Ice mutter.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, the cooperative movement was a fundamental, miracle. It's absolutely the idea of Chavrusa, it's the idea of Kehillah. It was fantastic. Through the cooperative movement, working people got a burial. Previously, they had paupers' graves, but they mutual. The cooperative movement was the basis of the building societies, if anybody remembers them. The way that people put in and mutual aid got retrieved a home in the world. So but essentially the cooperative movement was kind of destroyed by the welfare state. I mean, it was the means through which people preserved each other. Gordon, I'm looking for you. So I'm really committed to the renewal of those traditions. But they're definitely weaker than they were.
Right, I have one more question in the chat, which is also from Lewis, and then I'm going to return the screen so I can see everyone in case there are any kind of face-to-face questions. And Rabbi Sam, if you're listening, I think the settings need to be in a way that people can selectively unmute for this part.
Yes, I've changed it so that people can selectively unmute themselves now.
Thank you. Okay, which is okay. So there's the last question currently in the chat, Maurice. Excluding Wales, last week's local elections were not favourable to the Labour Party. What do you think the leadership needs to do to turn around Labour's favours? They do seem to be more than slightly in the doldrums at the moment.
Well,
We had also a fascinating conversation about this last week.
Yeah. So the temptation in politics is to always ask Lenin's question, what is to be done? But before you can answer Lenin's question, you've got to answer Marvin Gaye's question, which is what's going on, and at the moment, all the different traditions in Labour, I mean, the Labour right, the Labour centre left, the middle, they've all failed. Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband, Jeremy Corbyn, now Keir Starmer. They have to understand that we're living in a new era, and in this new era, that's the curious thing I mentioned before. The working class matter. They thought the working class didn't matter. They abandoned them and neglected them and told them to move and told them to re-educate themselves. They abandoned the working class, but the working class do matter, and they are very important. And so they've got to learn to engage with that. And the places that they live, that needs to be a covenantal renewal about housing, about integrity, about civic peace. These are all extremely important things. And then, have a proper industrial strategy and a proper economic policy. But Labour at the moment, all the fuss and all the noise is all about what to do. You put it in a text to me, Harvey. It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
That was my message on Friday morning after the by-election result.
It's not gonna, and it went on over the weekend. No, we've got to rediscover our tradition. We've got to understand where we are, have confidence that people are social beings, that we have to live together. They've got to rediscover, democracy is a really important inheritance. They've got to rediscover liberty, that you've got to be able to talk freely and not be condemned all the time for any miscommunication or missteps. People are, I think, afraid of what a Labour government should be like. So there needs to be a fundamental reorientation within Labour, built around the leadership and respect for the working class who have saved our country before and will do so again.
Now,
that's my basic answer to that one.
Thank you. Now, there aren't any more questions in the chat. There's a little time more for those who might want to ask a question face to face. Now, to do this, you're going to have to wave in some way using a virtual wave. You can press the button, or you can take yourself off mute and then speak. So, would anyone like to do that?
It's like an academic.
Perhaps I can ask a question, Lord Glasman.
Please.
This is Rabbi Fromson, our community rabbi.
So, and it could just be that I'm coming from a different paradigm, or maybe I just haven't learned enough political theory or political philosophy. I'm really struggling to understand what you mean when you say the working class will redeem the country. I just don't understand the terminology even. Like, what does it?
Okay, I get it. So it goes back to what I said earlier. The world can be very ugly. We've had, it's when you think about politics, you've got to think about that, about evil, and about the capacity for oppression and exploitation and polarization and violence and those things, and how to avoid them. So when I talk about the working class, what I mean is that if you look at Germany, or if you look at France or Spain, for example, there was very strong working class support there for fascist movements and very strong support there for communism. That didn't happen here. So when I say that the working class redeemed our country when it came to the Second World War, is that people went and people fought and people made the sacrifices necessary. It's so from my side, it's very important to see that that was, for example, a redemptive thing, a very important moral action. And it's still the case, I think, that we should fear polarization and we should fear social conflict, and that we should attend to the values and the interests of Labour, of not Labour as a party, but Labour as an interest, as a factor. And
so maybe that's what I'm missing. What do you what does that mean? Doesn't everyone, when Labour, isn't that does that mean working?
Yeah, so okay, so Labour technically is dependence on a wage rather than inherited capital. So there's a way of looking at this that between capital and Labour, that there is a tension there. And obviously the interests of capital are the maximisation, as you know from your conversations today, is the maximisation of return in the quickest possible time. And that leads to this enormous pressure to turn both Labour and the environment into a commodity. So that's the importance of the Labour politics, is that upholds a human status for Labour in relation to capital. Does that begin to answer your question?
It definitely does, yes.
Brilliant. But there's more to say.
There's a lot more to say, but I'll hold back for maybe another time.
You
Get my education another time on this.
Yes. Thank you. Are there any more questions? Please speak up. You're very okay. Jackie Zinkin, please take yourself off mute, and Ruth Glasman will be next.
Look, having grown up in the industrial north,
yeah,
and then worked in the supermarket end of higher education, the former polytechnic area, people have been given the impression that being working class is something one has to escape from, and being middle class is something one has to aspire to. And our education policy and even our adaptation of the industrial heartland has seemed to be following this line, and also the Labour Party assumptions. So how do we change this attitude that actually it's not a dirty word to say that you are working class and you've always got to aspire to being a professional or whatever, rather than actually what has come out of possibly a chance, maybe in the Queen's speech, of the skills of what was known as the working class have become an essential part of moving forward.
Well, Jackie, I'm completely with you on that. And that's part of the estrangement of Labour from the working class, the obsession with academic qualifications, the disintegration of the vocational system. So quite a lot of my work is about how to rebuild that vocational sector, because we're going to need skilled workers. It's going to be absolutely necessary. And we certainly don't really need more social science graduates, and I kind of speak as one, so I'm aware that should be the case. I mean, I think that you've just put your finger on it, and the point being is that a sense of belonging, attachment, community, of contribution, obligation. These are the fundamental things that people. So that there is in the period of globalization that I spoke about, the idea was individual autonomy, education, no responsibilities, the fulfillment of the individual, and I think it's very important to reconnect with ideas of belonging and community and the realization of yourself in loving relationships. Those ideas, rather than an exclusive concentration on career and success. So that, Jackie, do you see that's where the whole thing is. So I think around the. So I'm in favour, I go into a lot of trouble, I'm in favour of closing half the universities and turning them into vocational systems, for example. You know.
Yeah, I would go back to the polytechnic system tomorrow.
And make it real this time.
Absolutely, because it was at one point, it was an opportunity. And anyway, I could go on for hours, but Promise I won't.
I'm really with you, Jackie. That's a very good way of understanding it, is through the concept of vocation and the renewal of the dignity of those vocations. So
Definitely.
why we value accountants above plumbers has always been a mystery to me.
Yeah.
You know.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was a question from Ruth Glasman. Ruth, you have to unmute yourself.
I think actually that Jackie's probably covered most of it. A gentleman said that Labour was working people and the others were inherited wealth. What about all those in between?
Yeah. The mix. So obviously, I would not obviously, but just so you know. So I'm very much in favour of greater home ownership and those things. I'm just thinking of, about is that Labour's been devalued, and the concept I was talking about.
I don't think Labour is devalued. I mean, we need workers, we need people to do things. Not everybody can be academics and accountants and professors. Somebody's got to actually do the work, get their hands dirty, and we need those people. But they should be recognised for their worth.
I think so. I think that's right. I'm completely right. But there was this, beginning in 1979, there was this deindustrialization, the investment in China, and in China, there's no dignity for Labour at all. I think this is a very important factor coming in. They don't allow any freedom of association. There's no trade unions. There's no liberty. So
there's all the factories that we keep seeing on the news. There's no dignity there. No, but in England, and Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it, the working classes are coming up and demanding their rights, demanding to be heard, and wanting to know everything. But a lot of them are very educated.
Yeah, definitely. So
it's perfectly possible for anybody from any background to come up and get to the top.
Yeah, but not everybody. A lot of people just don't want to get to the top. They just want to have a stable life.
Yeah, and a pound in their pocket for the beer at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that's to be honoured.
That is a generational thing. Are there children being better educated?
I think that's open to question, wouldn't you say?
I said, are the children of the workers being better educated so that they will have different aspirations?
Well, that goes back to Jackie's point, is that not everybody wants just an academic or professional education. There's got to be ways of also having a meaningful, fulfilled life, with skilled labour and those things. So greater vocation is part of this idea.
Thank you.
Oh, pleasure.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if there is one, although there doesn't have to be. Okay, so I'm going to bring the evening to a close by thanking Lord Maurice Glasman very much for joining us and sharing his ideas. I think you will agree that the contrast between the three evenings, Lord Monroe Palmer, my first guest 2 weeks ago, Lord Gordon Wasserman, who's actually on and who joined us last week, and Lord Glasman have been tremendous. They've all been very different and engaging evenings. Particularly thanks to Stephen to Maurice for being very frank, sharing his background, his ideas. And
by the way, Harvey, Lord Wasserman and I, we both worked with Yuvo about the Yiddish stuff. I thought I should.
Yes, so Gordon spoke about Yuvo last week and archiving a little bit. So we've somewhat covered that. And so yes, so there are a number of shared overlapping projects and ideas. I suppose it's inevitable. We're going to finish the evening with a piece of music. Maurice chose the music with which we began, and he's playing the music with which we're going to end, which is a Gershwin piece. Good evening and thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Good night. Thank you for joining me. Looking forward to seeing you over Shavuos.